Well, let's get into these mechanisms and talk about what they are and how they go awry.
Well, the analogy I like to use is the car analogy. And for your car to go, you've got to have the right fuel in the tank, and that's all about diet and gut function. You've got to have some oxygen there, and that's all about breathing techniques. Then you need my favorite subject, mitochondrial engine. And pretty much every single living cell in the whole of the natural world, bar a few primitive yeast and bacteria, are powered by mitochondria. It's a common engine that powers all life. And then we need, for mammals anyway, well, for living animals, you need the thyroid accelerator pedal, and that controls how fast your mitochondria go. And you need the adrenal gearbox, and that's what allows us to gear up in response to a demand. So, if a saber-toothed tiger leaps out at me, I've got to run the fastest 100 meters I've ever done and get up that tree, otherwise I become breakfast. And to be able to do that, you need a massive output of energy to achieve. So that's the analogy that I like to use. But we always start off with the fuel in the tank. And for many people, that's all they have to do. If they get their diet right and their gut function right, everything else falls into place. And it's the thing they have to do first. And it's also the most difficult thing they have to do because it means changing the habits of a lifetime. And my view is that the big thing that gets in the way is addiction. And it's addiction to sugars and carbohydrates that is the single greatest hurdle. And if you can get off sugar and carb addiction, and guess what? 99.9% of us Westerners are sugar and carbohydrate addictions. In the short term, it gives you a little hit of energy, but it makes things much worse, in the longer term. So, and that is an important thing. So I talk about a paleo ketogenic diet, but that comes in many forms. The sickest patients I have, the ones who are worst off, I often start them on a carnivore diet. And a carnivore diet is, it's very simple to prepare. There's no question about the rules. If it comes from an animal, if it's meat, fish, eggs, or butter, butter is a great carnivore food, then, those are the rules. They're very simple rules. It's very satisfying, but it's also very low toxic diet. People forget, if you look at life from the point of view of a plant, it doesn't want to be eaten. Now, you and I don't want to be eaten either, but we can run away. Plants can't do that. So to make themselves protect themselves from being eaten, they have to make themselves as poisonous and as toxic as they possibly can. And that also, they have to be poisonous and toxic against bacteria and yeast and viruses as well. So all plant material is intrinsically toxic. Now, thankfully, we have a great liver system, a detox system that can cope with many of those toxins. But for many people, and we're all poisoned, that could be a subject we could talk all day about poisoning others. For people who are poisoned, that is just another load on the liver. And for the liver to be able to detoxify, guess what? It needs lots of energy. It needs lots of raw materials, and these people are often deficient. So the carnivore diet is often the most frictionless, quickest way to get started. Some people can't face that prospect early on, but I often find that the prospect of doing it is actually much worse than the actuality. As I say to all my patients, just do it. But the key point of the diet is low carbohydrate, high in fat. We should be fueling our body with fat for energy. And the reason for that is the preferred fuel of mitochondria. Now, as I say, mitochondria are the engines of our car. So, I've got the old truck out there that runs on diesel. She will go on petrol a bit, but she doesn't like it. She goes much better on diesel. And it's exactly the same with us humans. We can go on sugars and carbs. We can get a lot done on that, but it's very damaging to the engine. Because when you burn sugars and carbs in mitochondria, you produce a lot of free radicals. You produce a lot of exhaust fumes. And those exhaust fumes are very damaging. Whereas if we run on fat and ketones are the most desirable fuel. They can pass through mitochondria in a very frictionless way. They produce minimal free radicals. They have minimal damage to mitochondria, to the engines of our body, and therefore they are the desirable fuel. In fact, I'll tell you a story.
Please.
This pertains to the Gulf War in 1991. Now, what's so interesting about that is that the frontline troops were told, don't expect to be refueled, to be recharged, to be resupplied in the first 5 days. You've got to carry everything you need for 5 days. And of course, if you are a soldier, fighting in the middle of the desert, the last thing you want to run out of is ammunition. So these guys stocked up with lots of ammunition at the expense of food. And that meant that by day 3, 4, and 5, they weren't well fed, they were hypoglycemic, they made bad decisions, and that's when all the deaths from friendly fire occurred. Because as I understand it, more people killed in the Gulf from friendly fire than from enemy fire. So the United States Army commissioned Dr. Kieran Clark, researcher at Oxford University, Australian, to find out what was the most efficient fuels for those frontline soldiers to carry. Lightest, the best, most bang for your buck, as it were, the lightest fuel with the most power. And she came up with beta-hydroxybutyric acid. Now, beta-hydroxybutyric acid, nasty name, but essentially it's what fat is converted into so that it can power mitochondria. And she made it synthetically in the lab. She then fed it to world-class athletes, top rowers, top runners, top tetrathletes and cyclists. And what she found is that nearly all of them improved their personal best because they had the perfect fuel for their mitochondria, and they could run and they could perform for longer and at a higher level. Typically marathon runners who, if they're running on sugars and carbohydrates, if they don't have something to eat, they hit a wall at 17 miles. We call it hitting a wall. In this country, I think the Americans call it bonking. But they hit that wall if they don't have something to eat. Not so the keto athletes. Those keto-adapted athletes, either they were keto-adapted because they've been doing it for some time, or they'd been fueled up by Dr. Kieran Clark's beta-hydroxybutyric acid. They don't hit a wall. They can run and run and run. In fact, the world record for the longest distance run in 24 hours is held by a keto-adapted athlete called Mike Morton, and in 24 hours he ran 172 miles. He needed water. He probably needed electrolytes, but he didn't have to eat. He was running on fat. Fat is the perfect fuel for our mitochondria. So for many people, that is the single most important thing they have to do. And this is well backed up by science. Obviously, the science we've just talked about. There's a wonderful YouTube video I do recommend you look at by Dr. Kieran Clark. But we know dementia, for example. Dementia can be reversed with a ketogenic diet. Why? Because it's the perfect fuel for the brain. I mean, if you take a bit of brain and you cut into it, it doesn't bleed. It's just white, isn't it? Anybody who's watched Silence of the Lambs remembers that final scene of Hannibal Lecter slicing off some brain, and it's white. It's not full of blood. Whereas if you cut into my muscle, if you cut into a steak, it oozes blood. So that begs the question, how does the brain get fuel to it? And the answer is the brain is largely comprised of fat. Ketones are incredibly fat soluble, and they can very easily get from the bloodstream into the brain without, a massive blood supply. So the brain loves ketones as a fuel. And, many religious leaders know this. The samurai warriors knew this. Before any altercation, before any battle, the samurai warriors would fast for 24 hours. Why? They'd be in ketosis. And in ketosis, their brains would work better, so their reflexes were better, and their muscles were stronger. And guess what? You need both of those things to come out alive at the end of a battle. So ketones is the desirable fuel. And you don't have to do a carnivore diet to get into ketosis. Just cutting out the carbs is a great start. So people always ask me, "Oh, what do you eat?" So a typical day, breakfast will be bacon and eggs. Just bacon and eggs, no bread with it, no fried bread, no potato or anything else, just bacon and eggs, absolutely delicious. Lunch is usually leftovers from last night. And what I have for supper, well, the starter would be maybe a tin of prawns or smoked fish, or I've got some very nice olive patty at the moment, or I made some cod's roe patty, really easy to make, just eat it off a spoon. And then main course would be a piece of meat, fish, more eggs maybe, I love eggs, and then green vegetables from the garden. And the pudding would be coconut cream, which is just 2% carbohydrate, and maybe some fruit from the deep freeze. I'm very lucky, I'm a gardener, so I've got a deep freeze full of berries. And berries are fairly low in sugars, so and that doesn't knock me out of ketosis. And then don't snack. And guess what? You don't need to snack. One of the joys of this diet is you don't get hungry. And you don't run out of fuel. I mean, I might feel a bit peckish, and guess what? I'm greedy. I love my food. But if I think to myself, is the brain working okay? Guess what? Yes, it is. Is the body functioning well? Guess what? Yes, it is. I don't need it. That is greed, not need. And the less the sugar and the carbohydrates you have, the less you crave for them. And we know that's true of all addiction, isn't it? If I had somebody who wanted to give up smoking, and I said to them, oh, it's okay to have 1 or 2 a day, we all know that's bad advice. That just switches on to the craving, and they want more, and they want more, and they want more. Guess what the alcoholics celebrate when they do Alcoholics Anonymous? They celebrate complete abstinence. They know if they have one drink, they want another and another and another, and they're back on, and they've fallen off the wagon again. So sugars and carbohydrates are in the same category of addiction as alcohol, smoking, nicotine, caffeine, and all that. And, I know I'm an addict. Both my parents died from addiction. We can all see it in ourselves very easily if we're honest. And I find to give up addiction, I have to give up them all, because one addiction tends to switch on another. Have a bit of chocolate, have a bit of coffee, and I want a drink, and and on it goes. So if I give up it all, now I'm no paragon of virtue. Here we are. It's in the autumn at the moment. We've had a fantastic summer, and I've had a plum tree fruit like it's never fruited before. And guess what? I can't resist those plums, so I do tuck into a bowl of plums for pudding. And okay, maybe it knocks me out of ketosis for a while, but that doesn't matter. The plum tree is going to stop producing plums next week. There won't be any more. I'd have had my fill, and I should be back on the wagon again. And that's how it was for primitive man. You see, when people ask me, what should I be eating? Should I be doing the GAPS diet or the FODMAP diet or the what diet, whatever? Always, whenever you get a difficult question like that, always go back to evolutionary biology. What did we evolve over gazillions of years consuming? And the answer is a paleo-ketogenic diet. And yes, there were sugars and carbohydrates there for a short time in the autumn. And in fact, I think this is where carbohydrate addiction evolved. Because if again, look at life from the evolutionary point of view, what constrained our population was food supply. If there's plenty of food, we flourished. If we're in short supply, we starved. So we had to evolve techniques that conserve that food supply and consolidate as best as possible. So when carbohydrates are in abundance, when there's a free fall there's a windfall of fruits, of nuts, of seeds, of grains in the autumn, then we need to eat them and eat them and eat them so we get fat. And in eating and eating and eating them and getting fat, that's survival value for the winter. But it's more interesting than that. The last thing we want to do is go rushing around playing rugby and football and ice hockey and burning off all that precious food. Eating those foods makes us fatigued. It's an evolutionary survival policy. So when sugars and carbohydrates are in abundance, we switch on the carbohydrate gene, we eat and eat and eat, we get fat, we get fatigued, we don't spend that energy, and that's all in the pantry, that's survival value for the winter. But by contrast, when the winter comes along, there are no sugars and carbohydrates. We start to burn those fats to get into ketosis. And when you are in ketosis, you get clever and you have more energy. And that's what you need to be able to hunt. And, primitive man was a hunter. He hunted those big herbivores, the bison and the elephant and the mammoth. And if he and his tribe, or she and her tribe, could make one kill, a big herbivore like that would feed a tribe for a month. It's a massive game. So the cleverer you are, and the more physically able and active and the more stamina you have, the more likely you are to succeed. And of course, the carbohydrate addiction gene is switched off because there are no carbohydrates. But of course, the problem now with modern food supply is we can eat those carbohydrates every day of the week if we want to, because we can. They're there, they're in supply. The carbohydrate addiction gene never gets switched off. So that's the problem with modern life. And once people get that idea, because giving up carbohydrates is difficult, so they have to really establish that intellectually in their mind that, oh yeah, that's the reason why we do this, and then appreciating all the diseases that sugars and carbohydrates and ultra processed foods are associated with, and guess what, we don't want to die of those. Then they have the intellectual power to say, right, I'm going to do this wretched diet, whatever it takes, and I'm going to stick with it for life, because that's what you should all be doing. Paleo ketogenic diet, or a carnivore diet, or a carnivore intense diet, which I'm not completely carnivore, I have to confess. Especially at this time of year, I'm a keen gardener, so I do have green vegetables, but I'm in ketosis and I feel well, so I think that's good enough for me. So that's the first thing to say, to get the diet established, and to say for many people that's all they have to do.
Coming back to your diet, you gave us an idea coming into fall what you're eating. How will that change in the winter? Because you're not going to have access to your plums. You won't have access to berries. Does that mean you go carnivore at the time?
And green vegetables, Now, I do have a deep freeze, so I do have berries in the deep freeze, so I do cheat a little bit. But the thing is you see, one doesn't have to be a paragon of virtue 24/7. I know I can get away with some berries. I enjoy them. I love them. It's my great treat in the evening, especially with a big dollop of coconut cream, which is, as I say, is pretty much pure saturated fat and only 2% carb. So I'm a bit better off than primitive man. But yes, I say in the winter I'll have sprouts. I've got brassicas in the gardens. I've got some pulses in the deep freeze, some broad beans, and yes, I do have a few potatoes. But the way I love potatoes, but the way I cook them is I boil them up in the morning and let them cool down. And that converts some of the starch into resistant starch. And I slice it very thinly and fry them in pig fat or beef fat or coconut oil, and I only need 2 or 3, and I'm very satisfied. It fills me up. I don't have to have a lot of them. In fact, that's the basis of my addiction test, because I know I'm an addict, and my addiction test is if I can have a couple of, and I don't want any more, that's fine. So if you gave me a bar of 100% chocolate, I'd have a couple of squares and I wouldn't want any more. But if you gave me a bar of 60% chocolate, I wouldn't be happy until the whole bar had gone. So that's my personal addiction test. If I can have a couple of chips of potato and I don't want any more, that's okay. But if I have one of, if somebody offered me a biscuit, for example, and I ate it, the whole packet would go. If somebody offered me a crisp and I ate it, the whole packet would go. I'm that much of an addict. So I do have the self-control to say no to the first crisp or the first, biscuit, but not the third or the fourth or the fifth. It's the same with nuts. I love nuts, but cashew nuts, I adore them. If I have one cashew nut, the whole packet goes. So I know I can't have cashew nuts, but offer me a Brazil nut and I'll have one and I don't want any more. So that's a useful, well, it works for me, and I find many people find that a useful guide.
What about your PK bread? Is that still a staple?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And it's very easy to make. These days, I tend to make it. I used to make a loaf, and then I made rolls, and then I made flatbreads. These days, I roll it out really thin to make crisp bread, and that keeps much better. And yes, that's delicious. A big slab of butter on it, and then the pate or the fish or the cod's-roe pate or whatever it is that I've got, liver pate, is a great starter for an evening meal.
All right, so point blank, you're having an animal-based diet, at times carnivore-ish. Do you think you'd be better off taking plants out completely? Are they just in there for fun? I just want to make sure we're clear on this.
That's a very, very good question. The fact of the matter is we do have a great liver that is very good at detoxing, so we can get away with stuff. And I suppose the answer is the sicker you are and the older you get, the more you have to toughen up with the diet. Because I'm a keen gardener and I've got lots of stuff in the garden, I hate not consuming that. So... But I'm in the throes of turning my garden into more carnivore garden, so that I've got chickens, for example. So I'm going to protect all the areas that I'm growing and let the chickens free range through the rest of it. So I can get more eggs and more chicken out of that. So but now at the moment, I know I'm not perfect carnivore, but I should think 80% of my calories, 90% of my calories come from carnivore. And so at the moment, there's plums in the garden, which are a bit of a temptation, and Brussels sprouts and cabbage, but they're all fairly low GI. But the bottom line is, it doesn't knock me out of ketosis. I'm always in ketosis, and that is the key. You see, sugar is an essential for the body. We cannot live with zero sugar. And of course, the body can get round that with a carnivore diet because we can convert protein into sugar if necessary. But sugar is an essential raw material to make DNA, to make RNA, to make the energy molecule ATP. We also use sugar for detoxification in the liver. So it is an important molecule, but it's also a very dangerous molecule. Just like petrol in your car, it's essential to make the car go. But, you can make Molotov cocktails and bombs, can't you, out of petrol? It's very inflammable, dangerous stuff. And sugar is the same. So the body has mechanisms for keeping sugar under very tight control. We should keep the blood sugar between 4 and 6.5 it would be perfect. In fact, some people find that continuous glucose monitoring is very helpful. And, on Amazon, in this country, for about 60 quid, you can get a monitor, you can stick it on the back of your arm, you can read it on your smartphone, and you can see exactly what is happening, when you consume different foods. Because different people do respond to eating sugars and carbs differently. We're all unique in our own way. So let's just talk briefly about how we control blood sugar, because that's very important.
Sounds good. Actually, first though, let me ask you one more follow-up there. The one argument you'd get from somebody having an animal-based diet with low-carb vegetables would be the fiber for the microbiome. And then producing short-chain fatty acids. So I want your thoughts on that.
That is a brilliant question, and it's one I have agonized over, I can assure you. And talking and listening, watching podcasts and listening to people who are doing carnivore diets, what's so interesting is that the quality of the microbiome improves. Now, it improves in terms of numbers and diversity, as I understand things. Again, the key thing about the microbiome is we don't know anything about it. We know very little about it. There are hundreds of papers that have been produced that says, well, this is associated with that and this is associated with the other, but we still don't really know how to improve the microbiome. Now, my personal view is that the single most important thing you can do is to eat organic food. Now, you may be aware of Stephanie Senath's book, A Toxic Legacy, where she's talking about glyphosate. Glyphosate is the most widely used pesticide in the world, but it's extremely toxic stuff. It's a known carcinogen. It's a known mutagen. In her book, Senath calculates that in America, glyphosate is used at such a rate that is equivalent to about every American consuming about a pound of glyphosate a year. Call that 450 grams, 365 days a year. On average, the average American is consuming 1 gram of glyphosate a day. Now, 1 gram of glyphosate is not a trace amount. That is the therapeutic dose. Most drugs come in milligram amounts. So we're consuming this pesticide at 100 or 1,000 times the level of a prescription drug, prescription drug for blood pressure, for example. Senath points out that 54% of the microbiome is sensitive to glyphosate, is killed by glyphosate. And my guess is that many of the tests we're doing and the research we're doing is not factoring that into the equation. So, first of all, the first important thing we know is that a carnivore diet is not at all damaging for the microbiome. In fact, it's probably very good for the microbiome. And I can show you case histories of where some of the best results have come from people doing a carnivore diet. And the second thing is eat as organic as you possibly can. Now, if you'd asked me that question 3 months ago, you'd have got a different answer. If you'd asked me that question 3 months ago, I'd said, oh, yes, a diverse gut microbiome is very important. And we probably achieve that by consuming a diverse diet. And there's some logic to that. I can see how that, different fibers would, different microbes would predicate on different foods, for example. But I don't know if you're familiar with a wonderful author called Professor Nick Lane, who writes extensively on mitochondria, evolutionary biology. And I was rereading his mitochondria book the other day. And he made the point about the microbiome and carnivore diets, which I thought was fascinating, is that bacteria live on the waste products of other bacteria. It's like that's saying, little fleas have big fleas on their backs to bite them. Little fleas have lesser fleas, and so ad infinitum. So one bacteria will produce lactase as a waste product, and that will be gobbled up by another bacteria, which will produce something else as a waste product, and so it will go on. So you might get chains of bacteria and viruses and yeast all, consuming each other's waste products. And that may be part of the explanation why, a carnivore diet might not be diverse in terms of the different fibers that are there, but actually is a very rich diet. Very often my carnivore patients say that, when they're eating a lot of fat, they get fat coming through in the stool. And you can imagine protein coming through in the stool as well. And bacteria loving that. It's a free food, it's a free lunch for them, isn't it? So I hear what you're saying, but I don't, I think that, and again, we evolved eating a carnivore diet. So that must be right for our microbiome. We've got hundreds of thousands of years of evolution to back that up. And people eating sugar, carbohydrate, highly processed foods usually have a narrow microbiome with small numbers, but which can't be good.
You talked about the importance there of going organic, reducing the glyphosate. When it comes to animal foods, how do you look at quality there?
If you look at the actual amount of a toxic chemical, per kilogram, it's much, much lower in meats and carnivore foods than it is in vegetables. And that's because the animals themselves have a chance to process those toxins out. And again, one of the big problems with glyphosate is it's often applied pre-harvesting. You see, if you're a farmer and you've got a field of wheat or corn or barley or whatever, what you want to do is you want to harvest it bone dry. If it's harvested wet, then it costs a fortune in the silos, the grain silos, because you have to dry it out. You spend a lot of money, blasting hot air through to dry it out. So you want to harvest dry, and the way they do that is just before the harvest is ready to come, the whole thing is sprayed with glyphosate and it's killed. And if it's killed, the water just disappears out of it. And so you can harvest it bone dry. But what that means is that all that glyphosate that you're spraying on goes straight into the grain silos. It goes straight into the food chain. So we're getting very high levels in our grains and anything else that might be sprayed pre-harvest. My guess is the grains, it's the soya, which are the most intensively polluted. Foods like avocado and coconuts, which are high in fat, they're not sprayed at all or barely at all. They're the most organic we can consume. Many fruits are sprayed. The worst sprayed of all in this country are strawberries. Of course, because you see, the fruit producers themselves know that we're sugar addicts. And so and of course you want to sell something, you produce something addictive, don't you? Whether it's cigarettes or alcohol or sugar or whatever. So the fruit producers are breeding lines of fruit that are sweeter and sweeter and sweeter. And of course that makes them even more attractive to the bacteria and the yeast because they love sugar too. So many fruits, especially the sweet ones, are extensively sprayed throughout their growing and their harvesting. So these foods are going to have much higher levels of chemicals than carnivore foods. So I'm very privileged. I've got a small holding here. So I have my own pigs and chickens. And in this country, it's the pigs and chickens that are intensively reared, and they're the ones that receive a lot of poor quality grains and poor quality foods. I don't have sheep and cows because I live in Wales and everything out here is grass-fed. So I'm just looking at the field in front. I've got a field of cows and sheep, and guess what? They're all eating grass. So and that grass is never sprayed. So my rules are, I've got my own. If you're going to buy organic pork and organic chicken, but grass-fed, free range, lamb from New Zealand, cow from Argentina, for example, in this country from Wales or from England, would be pretty good stuff.
Do we have any idea of things like glyphosate going on the grains being fed to conventional animals? How much of that will end up in the food we eat?
It's a very good question. And the shameful thing is, nobody's done that study. I mean, a very dear friend of mine, Mark Purdy, was interested in organophosphates. And of course, glyphosates are also chemically organophosphates. And organophosphates used to be used regularly in this country for the treatment of warble fly. And you pour it down the back of the animal and it goes straight in. And of course, it comes straight out in the milk. And the one that was being used particularly in dairy products was one called fenthion. So he got in touch with the ministry here and said, how much fenthion is coming through into the milk of a cow that's, just been treated with organophosphate? Oh, they said, we don't know. We've never done that study, but it'll get mixed in with all the other cows, and therefore it'll be diluted, and therefore it won't be a problem. But they've never measured it. I mean, the shameful thing is that governments don't do research that might result in an unacceptable conclusion. They don't do what I call blue sky research. They only do research when they're pretty sure of the answer. So they don't want to know the answer to those sort of questions. And so that research isn't done. The answer is we don't know.
We have the toxicity aspect, like we just talked about. And then we have the nutritional potential there when it comes to chickens and pigs like yours, or grass-fed, grass-finished cows. How do you look at the importance of that from a nutrition perspective?
If you're eating grass-fed meat and organic, you're winning on both sides of the equation, aren't you? Because the toxic load is less and the nutritional quality is much higher. And there's a balancing act between these two things, because with really excellent nutrition is protective against toxic stress. So this is where a good carnivore diet is going to protects against the toxic stress of having some vegetables and nuts and seeds or whatever in your diet. As we mentioned before, food is intrinsically toxic, not just because it's been fermented, but because foods themselves have toxins like oxalates and phytates and tannins and phytoestrogens in which are toxic. But as I say, our liver can cope with them. But if you've got really good nutrition, good grass-fed meat, good organic food, it's not going to be a problem. That's how we've been eating for the past hundreds of thousands of years. But now we're all poisoned. We are all overloaded, not just with plant toxins and products of the upper fermenting gut, but with chemicals, with pesticides, with volatile organic compounds, with heavy metals, with goodness knows what metals they're using for cloud seeding, dental amalgam fillings, aluminium in vaccines. We're all poisoned with these heavy metals. In fact, I must have done, certainly hundreds of toxicity tests, either fat biopsies looking for pesticide levels or volatile organic compounds, or urine tests with a chelating agent looking at heavy metals. I've never seen a normal result. We all, without exception, carry a toxic load. Now, I say, thankfully, the liver is very good at dealing with that, but we're getting overwhelmed. And there's no question that heavy metals are carcinogenic, mutagenic. So are many pesticides and volatile organic compounds. So we have to do everything within our power to keep that toxic load down. And the sickest patients are going to be the most poisoned. And the sickest patients are those that need the least toxic diet. And that's why I often start them off on carnivore. And then in parallel with that, do detox regimes, which are very simple. We can all do them. You don't need a special expensive clinic. Do detox regimes to reduce our total toxic load. And that could be we could spend a whole podcast talking about that, Jesse.
If you enjoyed that clip, you're going to want to head over here and catch the full episode. I'll see you over there.
I don't think that many doctors get this, is that energy delivery mechanisms are at the root of all pathological conditions, almost without exception. They are vital in preventing and reversing dementia, preventing and